And you'll let people in? Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait another minute or two to allow people to enter into the webinar. This is Howard Newkrug, and we'll start in about a minute. Again, welcome everyone. We'll start in exactly 1 minute from now. Well, I've already gotten a text with not a question, but asked me to tell a few jokes while we wait. But I think instead, I'll save you all, and we'll start the speaker series. Welcome to the Water Center's the Water Center at Penn. Hello. If everyone could just mute themselves. Welcome to the Water Center at Penn's Water Exchange Speaker Series. I am Howard Newkrug. I'm the Executive Director of the Water Center at Penn. I am so delighted to have Dr. Jalan White Newsom with us from the Kresge Foundation. Jalan's going to talk to us today about advancing climate resilience and water equity in uncertain times. And that is like, I keep looking at that title of this talk, and I realize like, it's every single word there is so important. You know, are they talking about climate? You're talking about resilience, water equity, uncertain times. Oh my God, uncertain times. So really excited to hear what Jalan has to say. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with the Water Center, we are part of the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department at Penn, and we are among the newest centers within the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. We are an applied research center with our focus on solving urban water challenges, floods, droughts, old infrastructure, operational challenges, and many others. We welcome anyone interested in urban water issues to learn, to grow, to collaborate with us, and you can do so through our projects, through our research, or through our programming like this. Please reach out to us via our website or social media, or just send us an email. If you have friends or colleagues who are unable to attend the program today, please let them know that we are recording this session, and we'll share the program on our website and social media starting tomorrow. Next slide. Moving on to the program, we heard our previous viewers loud and clear. You want more discussion and more time to ask questions. To that end, Jalan is going to give a presentation that's going to last about 20 minutes. And we're counting on the rest of that time for some really good questions coming in from the audience. So think about them and put them into the Q&A section of the webinar. We really want to hear from you. Please type your questions into the chat room. I correct myself. and we will get as many as we can over the course of about 30 minutes. First, however, I'm thrilled to introduce to you Dr. Jalan White Newsom. Her full bio is online, so let me just state that she is an incredibly accomplished expert working at the nexus of urban water health, urban environment, equity, and philanthropy. She is a senior program officer at the Kresge Foundation, a private philanthropy that invests over $160 million a year to foster economic and social change in America's cities. At Kresge, Jalan is responsible for the grant portfolio on climate resilient and equitable water systems. She is also a core team member of Kresge's Climate Change, Health, and Equity Initiative, which is supporting grant making across the public health sector. Dr. White Newsom is also an adjunct professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and provides leadership on numerous boards, including the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Change and Society, the U.S. Climate Action Network, the Health Environmental Funders Network, and the Urban Water Funders Group. Jalan has recently been recognized by Who's Who in America and is a recipient of the Places Fellowship Program, which is advancing racial equity in philanthropies and the communities that they serve. With that, I will bring Jalan on board here, and let's hear what she has to say. And please remember to ask to put questions down to ask Jalan after the talk.
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Howard, and for all of the work of the Water Center. And I continue to remain excited about the products from our new partnership. I want to start out by really recognizing the fact that this past Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day. And at the foundation, this was the first year that it was actually a holiday for us. And I guess what I will say is that when you talk about acknowledging Indigenous peoples and how they have, really took care of the land, the resources, and the water before many of us even laid foot on this earth, it's so important. And I think a conversation that we need to continue to have and acknowledgments that we need to do as we start these conversations about one of our most precious natural resources, which is water. And so as I think about where I'm calling from, which is the land of the Powhatan and the Mississauga in southeastern Michigan, I encourage you, if you know what land that you're calling from, to throw it into the chat, put your name and acknowledge the land where you're sitting right now. And if you don't, I encourage you to figure that out. There are a lot of different websites out there that can tell you where, where you're sitting. And I think that's, again, so important and something that we've done throughout many years, particularly with this particular initiative. So thank you for that. Next slide. So as I stated, Kresge is based in southeastern Michigan, where I'm calling from today. And my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up and I was bred, a place that I'm super proud of, but also understanding that in the midst of all of the disasters and emergencies, particularly around water and its impacts on low-income communities and communities of color, we have a problem, particularly those that continue to suffer from repeated flooding. Next slide. And so as I think about articles like this, and this is just one that I see where it's, the victims blame the city, the victims of flooding blame the city and not the climate. That really resonates with me because this issue of climate-driven urban flooding, or the fact that we're seeing more flooding in more cities, is quite personal. Next slide. And so back in early 2016 is when I started at Kresge, and it was actually the height of the Flint water crisis. And so, this picture is a picture of my parents' basement. And this is one of the 6 times that their basement flooded. They live on the east side of Detroit. And what I will say, the article that I showed previously really speaks to me in a lot of ways, because I feel that there is great losses that are not only occurring in Detroit, but in many cities across this country. and it's due to many different factors, whether it be lack of climate planning, lack of understanding the risk in certain communities, or in some cases, the institutions and systems that are supposed to take care of people not actually working in that way. Next slide. So as we think about, again, the stories that we hear, the many news clippings, you know, again, there is definitely a disproportionate impact of flooding on low-income communities and communities of color. Last year, the National Academy of Sciences produced this report, and this is something I pulled from that report, really showing that, again, when you think about income, when you think about race, educational attainment, and some of the other characteristics, again, it is making certain populations more vulnerable to flooding. Next slide. So I pose the following questions as you think about the work that you might do, the work that you're thinking about engaging in, or even, you know, for the context of this conversation, you know, why do we continue to see the same stuff happening, particularly around water service delivery, infrastructure, flooding, affordability? Why do we continue to see this? And are there policies and practice and other behaviors that are actually perpetuating what we're seeing, particularly in communities of color? And then how are we coming at the solution? Do we have the right people? Are we talking to the right folks, involving the right folks? And then as I think about, you know, our power, my power, your power, what power do we actually have? What authority do we have? What privileges do we have to actually change the reality that we're seeing? So hopefully some of those questions will sit with you as we continue this discussion. Next slide. So as mentioned earlier, I've been with the Kresge Foundation for the last 5 years almost. And if you don't know Kresge, you might know us because the family got started from Kmart. So that's how the family made their fortune. And so we have our headquarters in Troy, Michigan, which is in southeastern Michigan, and we have a Detroit office. And again, our mission over the almost 100 years that Kresge has been alive has been to advance opportunities in America's cities for low-income communities. Next slide. And so we work to achieve that mission through grant making in 7 program areas. So we have program areas and areas of practice. So folks that work nationally, and then folks that work in place-based practices. And so, you know, it ranges from our education, arts and culture, environment, where I sit, to health and human services. But then we also have an interesting investment practice, a social investment practice, where we're able to really coordinate and align the programmatic missions with other forms of capital, like loans and guarantees, that we can deploy in an aligned mission to, again, advance opportunities in low-income communities. So it's really a very interesting mix of grant support and, again, these mission-related investments that can help unlock some capital barriers that grant money alone can't do. Next slide. So while much of our work at Kresge has centered, again, on advancing opportunities for low-income communities, I would say that we have been on a racial equity journey for about 10 plus years. So really understanding what racial equity means in the foundation space and in the larger field of philanthropy. But I would say in the last 2 years, we have really made some significant progress just in terms of turning the mirror on ourselves and really looking at some of the practices and policies we have in place and how we're actually achieving or not achieving our mission. And I think last year, our board of trustees approved adding equity as one of our foundational organizational values, which I think speaks volumes. And so how we think about the work that we do is that equity, and again, I won't read the whole definition, basically means that regardless of who you are, you have a right to reach your full potential. And so my hope is that we carry this over and continue to carry this into our grant making and our other practices, particularly in the role that I sit in the environment program. Next slide. So when I came to Kresge, it was definitely an opportunity to shift some things. Our environment program in general had always focused on climate change, mostly climate adaptation. But when the shift came from leadership and really understanding our focus on urban opportunity, we needed to kind of shift our strategy for grant making as well, particularly around water. And so my task when I joined was to really look at our water work and figure out how and what would be the best kind of strategy to really meet the needs of low-income communities and really understand how climate was impacting these communities in the water space. And so through many initial conversations, my own research and readings, I felt like there was a dearth of knowledge and really focus in grant making at the intersection of climate change, water, and equity. I mean, you know, some of you might be students, and when you're kind of doing a review and you're combing through the literature, and it's like I could find nothing of work at that intersection. And so then again, talking to really smart people like Howard and others, really understanding that the investment in terms of investment of time and research and grant making and even policy making to really address issues of urban flooding was not enough and had not been enough. And so again, urban flooding was the reality. It was the thing that had been hitting low-income communities and communities of color the hardest. And so my goal and really my vision was to, you know, figure out a strategy that would provide reliable and equitable services to community in our climate reality, particularly around urban flooding. And the strategy was to bring together a diverse set of water leaders. So from your community-based organizations to water utility leaders to really help unpack this and advance, you know, grant making and practice and activities that would really directly, you know, kind of uproot the institutional and systemic racism that has really been a part and still a part in some ways of the water sector. Next slide. So I have to definitely give credit to some early partners, particularly at the U.S. Water Alliance, American Rivers, and the Meridian Institute, because as I was kind of doing, you know, kind of my landscape assessment, you know, we were able to support some really preliminary publications about water equity and work at this nexus of climate change, water, and equity. And so I encourage you to check out these publications if you haven't. But essentially, it was a way to really define the sector, define what water equity really meant, really define what water equity, climate change, you know, meant to each other. And it was really also an opportunity for me to understand where the needs were and what my grantee partners needed to really move in this space that wanted to again, build their efficacy around climate, but also equity. And so again, these reports help to really pinpoint what were the barriers and then what, again, were the opportunities. Next slide. So as with everything I try and really figure out what is the vision. Like if we're going to create the strategy around climate change and water and equity, you know, at the end of the grant making, whatever it be, 5, 10 years, what do we want systems to look like across this country? And so I came up with really 7 characteristics that for me, anyone that, you know, that we partner with or that we bring into our grant portfolio needs to at least embody some of these characteristics or be working towards it. So the notion of nimbleness in response to climate, managing stormwater in a way where everyone benefits, providing multiple benefits, looking at the energy pieces of water movement, embedding climate into processes, and making sure that water doesn't remain a silo because water, health, transportation, all those folks need to talk together and scheme together, as I say it. So again, I am truly excited because I believe like every grantee partner we have is really working to embody a lot of these characteristics in their activities. Next slide. And I know this particular slide might be a little bit hard to read, but I thought it would be helpful to at least get a sense of our 3 strategic areas and who are the folks that are in those areas. And so, you know, we have this category of building urban leadership because I believe, again, we can't just support the utility leaders. We have to support communities. We have to support environmental advocates and practitioners. All these folks are needed to come up with the solutions to build more climate resilient systems. So you'll see, you know, a lot of peer learning, national networks, some community-based networks that fit in that first blue bucket. The second bucket is really around building the case. And I like to say, you know, what do I need to do to convince folks that I need to make a better and smarter decision? Oftentimes in addressing urban flooding, it takes a little bit of thinking outside the box. It's not always going to be the hardcore engineering solution. And I'm an engineer by training, so I love engineers. But we need to think beyond what we've done before. And so these folks in this bucket, the Nature Conservancy, the New School, Earth Economics, which puts dollar signs on different solutions, and then those that are working in the federal policy realm, again, are all a part of helping building the case and creating an environment where we can move and see the change that we want to, particularly in the water sector. The last bucket, non-traditional approaches, is where I get super excited, because this is where, again, we have a lot of our partnerships with social investments that are really focused on unlocking financial barriers, basically anything that keeps money from moving in disinvested communities that are dealing with urban flooding. How can we use our grants and our loans and our guarantees to just kick that barrier out the way? And then also there's a group of place-based exemplars that I think everybody should know about, that I feel in many ways are doing the work right. Between community, between utility, between a lot of different folks, arts folks, everybody, again, that can serve as examples of what it really means to build a climate resilient and equitable water system. And then the folks at the bottom that are not at the bottom, but super important, are what we call field building. So folks that are developing tools and databases that everybody can use and practices. And so Georgetown Climate Center's adaptation database, which contains a lot of case studies around green stormwater infrastructure and urban flooding, along with the tools that the Trust for Public Land has developed for multiple cities. So this just gives you a sense of the breadth of the partners that we have, and it's just, again, a privilege to work with all these folks. So next slide. So I think while the individual work of the organizations that you saw on that last slide is super important, I am all about trying to build community, because, again, we can all have our kind of separate lanes and avenues, and until we begin to kind of bring all of our expertise and experience and resources together, are we really going to tackle the water sector in the way that we need to? And so, again, some of the ways that we try and build community amongst the partners and even beyond is simply having things like listservs and webinars on different topics of shared interest. We have what we call a community of learning and practice, where, again, we come together around specific topics, whether it be related to water or something like related to COVID and mental health. And really, again, it's a way for folks to network, to learn more about what they're doing on the ground, share strategies and topics and challenges, and really just encourage each other. The other thing that I would say has been super important is our convenings. For the last 3 years, we've had annual in-person convenings in a grantee city, over 100 folks coming together, sharing and learning, and actually doing community service together in whatever community we landed in. And, you know, of course, now we're not going to have an in-person convening, but we will be having a mini virtual convening to, again, try and facilitate that same opportunity to network and share and encourage each other. And so I think that is something that makes this community super unique, because, again, you have community-based partners learning from utility directors and green stormwater infrastructure practitioners, you know, sharing knowledge to, you know, academics. So it's just a really rich discussion that happens. And I would say on my end, that last circle on the left is really my job, is to try and build stronger partnerships with peer foundations, to really get them to say, you know, hey, you know, I can see myself in this climate water equity work. And it's been a wonderful thing for me to work with the group of urban water funders and kind of co-fund different projects and organizations together. So that is the way that, again, we are trying to build community in this really, really large, complicated, wicked space called water. So next slide. I think it's also important to understand a couple of the ways that our grantees are doing the work, like actually, you know, making this thing happen, making the magic happen. And so, you know, again, if we're going to address climate change, it's going to take all of us, all of our individual talents and resources. And so, again, it might include folks that do research. It might include folks that are, again, documenting inequities. It might include folks that are really the advocates on the outside, pushing cities and governments to do better. Again, it is just wonderful to see these multiple tactics and strategies and experience that all these organizations bring to, again, make this foundation, this community stronger, and really have cumulative impacts, cumulative good impacts beyond this particular community. Next slide. So I want to share a couple examples of the work that's happening. And again, there is no way that I can talk about every single partner, but I thought as we talk about, again, as we started in terms of what does climate resilience and water equity really mean, hopefully some of these projects will highlight some of those topics and kind of get to some of those questions that I posed at the beginning. So the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice has been around for a long time, truly a leader, headquartered in New Orleans, dealing with many environmental injustices, particularly on the air quality side, water quality side. But again, as you think about the Gulf Coast, you know, in the last several years, there has been a lot of flooding and sea level rise that's going on, and not a lot of resources and attention. And so this particular project is really working in 5 Gulf Coast cities to really build the capacity of resident leadership to make change in their locality that addresses flooding. So whether it's getting an ordinance created or creating an environmental justice task force that's focused on flooding, this group, again, at Deep South, along with their partners on the ground, community-based organizations, are again making huge changes in the Gulf Coast and really looking forward to seeing more of what this work results in. Next slide. Sticking in the South, there is the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network. So this is a group of professionals that work in city governments that are committed to equity and sustainability. And so they have been working with, you know, again, within the 9 states that are part of this network in partnership with community, tackling issues of flooding and energy access. And so this is, again, another beautiful partnership that has developed and grown over the years between government and community. And again, coming up with that shared North Star to address, again, issues of climate resilience. Next slide. And I think what's also amazing is that the change comes from both the proverbial top and the bottom. And so this particular organization called Higher Ground, and I'll use the words of the founder of the organization, we have a bunch of scrappy groups from across the country, you know, moms and dads and folks that have been dealing with flooding, and they might not have a 501c3 or be incorporated or anything like that, but they want to fight for their community. And so that has been the notion of Higher Ground, bringing these groups across the country that are dealing with similar problems and giving them the technical assistance, the legal assistance, and the support to address flooding head on. And so it has been amazing to see the growth of this network. We were one of the early supporters about 2 or 3 years ago, and the network just keeps on growing. The number of partnerships keeps on growing. And I encourage you to check out their recent Flood Survivors Manifesto, which is really calling for some just concrete, very smart things that communities need to ask for and do in terms of policy and planning. So definitely check them out as well. Next slide. And one of the things that I always have heard over the past couple years is the lack of planning that happens at the local level due to not having, particularly as it relates to climate change, the right models or up-to-date models or up-to-date data, particularly with interstitial flooding that happens in neighborhoods, which is very complicated to model, if you can imagine. And so the Urban Systems Lab at the New School in New York is actually taking this on with an added, I would say, level of looking at social vulnerability, where flooding is happening, and using these, I would say, this different GIS modeling coupled with social vulnerability, coupled with community input to help decide where green stormwater infrastructure should be to provide the most benefits for that particular community. So they're starting out in 3 communities now. The goal is to see how transferable this model works. And again, if you know anything about, modeling, it can be super technical. And one of the things that I again, hear from cities is that we don't have the resources and time and capacity to develop models that get that granular. So my hope is that what the new school uncovers is a method and a methodology that can be used in different cities that don't have the capacity like a big New York or an LA or other cities that are pretty, kind of well established. So looking forward again to seeing what comes of this project too. Next slide. And I will say another barrier is with a lot of things is funding. And so one of the things that this particular partnership, Partners for Places, which is, a matching grant program that actually gives government and local foundations an opportunity to come together to address different environmental issues. In this case, we participated in the Green Stormwater Infrastructure funding. And again, these are, wonderful examples of how government, local philanthropy, and community come together to address a problem. And why this might seem like it's not a big deal, this is not often how local government, cities and communities operate. Oftentimes the relationship can be tense. It could be one where things that happen that has, caused distrust in many different ways. And so I think any way that we can continue to invest in the relationships, particularly the local relationships with community, is something that, again, we want to continue to try and model and support. So that's the Urban Water Funders Partners for Places program. Next slide. So the Green Infrastructure Exchange, again, is another group of folks, really started by folks from Philadelphia. And this is another large network. And what a lot of our folks say is that the amazing thing about a network is that you realize you're not alone. I might be in Tempe, Arizona, and talking to someone in Lima, Ohio. We might be in different geographies, but facing many of the same issues. And this is an opportunity and an infrastructure where we can compare our challenges, share ideas, share our frustrations, motivate ourselves. And what I love about the Green Infrastructure Exchange is that they, again, have really made a deep commitment to bringing equity, not only internally into their organizational structure, but in the ways that they do their re-granting to their partners. And so, again, just another wonderful resource of folks. And what I'll also say is they've been really kind of creative in creating these international learning exchanges. And I had an opportunity to go with two of their utility partners to the Netherlands, I think it was last year. And again, just really seeing how a country that literally has to live with water is, very similar in some cases to the challenges that we face here in the United States. And, it's not like I've traveled so much across the globe, but again, just even folks across waters, and it's just amazing how similar we are in many of our challenges despite where we are. So it was a wonderful learning opportunity and something that, again, the Green Infrastructure Exchange created. Next slide. So I want to get a little bit more into the finance piece. Because again, this is one of the barriers that folks in this space continue to talk about. And I think what was really interesting is that, while you have federal financing through WIFIA, state revolving funds, relatively cheap forms of money or financing, what I've learned is that if you're going to tackle this problem of flooding, it's necessary to explore other financial vehicles. And so similar to what happened in Washington, D.C. in terms of their environmental impact bond, which helped, support and pay for some of their water infrastructure, we wanted to really dig a little bit deeper and see if this environmental impact bond could be useful for some communities in the Chesapeake Bay region. And so we worked with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, where they reached out to a lot of different municipalities about this concept. And really happy to say that there is some traction in the city of Baltimore and the city of Hampton, Virginia, around how they can use an environmental impact bond to supplement and move work around green stormwater infrastructure. And what I'd say is this was more of kind of like a research to action type project, because while we want to see the EIBs or the environmental impact bonds actually take off in these cities, we also learned a lot that EIBs are not good for every city. So again, this is something that, this paper, this brief that they pulled together will really inform the larger sector as a whole. Next slide. And almost done. So another group that I want to highlight is Greenprint Partners. And what makes them so unique is that they are a missions-driven project developer, women-owned minority firm based in Chicago. that has really set this whole community engaged planning model that most project developers don't really do. And so they've been really instrumental in working with, for example, the city of St. Louis and their sewage district to deploy green infrastructure in places that probably wouldn't be at the top of their list. So community centers, churches, things of that nature. And they're taking this model and really using it across the country. And so again, as we think about those folks that make decisions, big decisions in the water sector, how do we make sure that the way that they're making the decisions, the process is equitable, the people that are involved, and that they, again, are coming with a strong climate understanding as well as a strong understanding and activation of equity. Next slide. And this whole notion of partnership, I cannot stress even more, but really excited about the work of the World Resources Institute in San Francisco. This might, again, not seem like rocket science, but from what I hear, and even my experience in state government, it's kind of hard for folks to work together. So what this concept of a joint benefits authority is trying to really get at is creating this mechanism where separate government departments come together, shared alignment, shared funding to support projects, in this case around green stormwater infrastructure. So is there a way to do that where it's integrated, inclusive for a city that, again, you're addressing flooding, but you're also addressing other issues of social inequity, economic development, all these different pieces. And so while this might not seem like a big deal, it can be a really huge deal, I think. And so this is the kind of the first of its kind that we've supported World Resources Institute to really investigate and see if we can make this model work in San Francisco. So really excited to look at what's to come with the JBA. Next slide. And I'll speak to the U.S. Water Alliance. Again, I mentioned them before as being one of the core partners at the beginning of this journey. And I would say their relationship and partnership building has been exemplary. We've supported different facets of their work, namely water equity tables, which has basically been groups of cities coming together to solve problems. And the city teams would, be composed of not only your utility director, maybe a local foundation, a community organization, an EJ organization, all these folks come together. That what I've heard through listening into these discussions and being a part of these discussions, some of the times these folks never really connected while they were actually in the city, but actually had the opportunity to connect, when they had these opportunities set up by the U.S. Water Alliance. And so we've had several boot camps and roundtables, particularly around climate resilience. And again, it's just been a wonderful opportunity to see how folks can learn together and again, learn from each other. So again, very excited about the work that they continue to do. Next slide. And I don't want to leave out just kind of the range of groups that are bringing so much to this challenge of urban flooding. And particularly, I think it's cool to do work at the national level and have kind of these big national things, but I would say where the rubber hits the road continuously is in the place-based work. I mean, that is where, again, the magic happens. And so I definitely want to, again, acknowledge the work of our folks that are working in Jersey, Atlanta, Seattle, Milwaukee, because they are just doing fabulous work that, again, we can lift up as models as we continue to try and preach the importance of climate resilient and equitable water systems. Next slide. And so I will also say that one of the gaps and one of my primary observations and really concerns was that when I started this work, there was no table, no coalition, no national network of community-based organizations or environmental justice organizations working on water. And to me, this seemed just like an obvious missing piece. And so it was kind of like, I was asking the questions, I'm like, well, who would be able to even assess to see if this is something that is needed or something that organizations wanted? And so fast forwarding to now, PolicyLink and the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy have really been giving leadership to this National Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus that really started as an idea and I think is a need for me. And What has been built is, again, a partnership of 90+ organizations, an agenda that has been created and shared with federal and state government focused on the issues of communities, led by the issues that are hitting communities the hardest, communities of color, low-income communities, and our indigenous communities. And so their work, whether it be in the climate caucus at the federal level, or really their work in building statewide solidarity amongst their members, I think will continue to kind of set the bar going forward for many of the water policies and the water actions we're going to see coming down the pipe, no pun intended. So very excited about the work of the caucus. Next slide. So with all that, in the 4+ years that Kresge has been around, what is ahead for 2021? I would say that we cannot not recognize the impact of COVID-19 on our groups. And I would say that our partners, we've been able as a foundation to give COVID response support, which has allowed them to continue to do advocacy, to train, to educate, and to do it safely. And even just give themselves, kind of like the mental break or the support that they need to continue to do the hard work. I always default back to one of the groups that, actually set up what they call a recovery garden. So it was a place where folks could come and garden, again, with PPE, COVID safe. But, again, it was just a space. And also this garden was green infrastructure that was managing and helping mitigate some of the flooding issues. But it was a place where communities could come together. So this is, again, an example of kind of a COVID response type thing that has multiple benefits. And we're going to continue to figure out, are there other ways that we can continue to support that type of work? We're looking at water equity metrics and what that means. How do we measure our individual impact, but also our collective impact? We're going to continue to provide training on topics that folks want to explore, more modeling, again, at the granular level. And I think most importantly in this nation right now, with racial unrest and climate just kicking our butt in so many different ways, there is a need, and we are going to continue as a foundation, even beyond the environment program, supporting the grassroots infrastructure and grassroots leaders, because they have long been ignored and underfunded, having come from that side of the community. And so we're going to continue to move that work and be supportive as we can. Next slide. So again, closing out here, depending on wherever you sit, again, what power, what privilege you hold, there are ways that we can continue to advance climate resilience and water equity. And so the first, and this is not an exhaustive list, but when I think about what's so important is that we, one, have to acknowledge the harm that's been done, particularly in communities. What unintentional consequences have we caused on the communities that we're supposed to protect? So that could be in the form of policy, practice, lack of response, but we need to understand and acknowledge that harm. Accountability is something that, I get on my kids about, but also I think is very relative in this space. Who are the folks that are supposed to protect us, and how are we holding those people accountable? Do we have any structures in place for accountability? Equitable access, whether it be park access, green stormwater infrastructure access, or access to funding and resources to improve communities and shore them up, again, because the flooding and the raining is not going to get any less. So how do we begin to, again, remove whatever barriers or excuses so folks have access so they can keep themselves and their community healthy and safe? We cannot not address racism, power, and privilege, plain and simple. The root causes of many of the issues that we're seeing in our country today is, again, this notion of hate that breeds racism, and that has, really, I would say, penetrated not only individuals, but our institutions and systems that have been around for decades and decades. So we have to begin to not ignore, but address. And then partnership. I'm big on that. We can do more together. And I'll just kind of leave that one at that. Next slide. So again, going back to the title, The Wait is Over. We cannot wait any longer. We need to begin now. We should have started this a long time ago, but two of my favorite quotes, and I have many, that I think, again, get at this notion of, fear and hatred and taking care or dismissing those that are most at risk or most vulnerable. Again, it takes all of us not kind of turning our heads, but staring the problem in the eye and tackling it. And even if it's hard conversations or uncomfortable conversations, those are the things that we have to do. That is what's going to get us to addressing, again, climate change, our lack of resilience in our systems and institutions, and hopefully creating a truly, truly equitable water future. So again, thank you all so much. And I think the next slide is the final slide for your attention. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jalan. Am I on speaker? Jalan, you can hear me, right?
Thanks.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Good. Well,
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm just so excited. So many things that you said. I reviewed your slides before you presented it, but you added so much more information there. It's just it was just really great to hear from you, and thank you, because the Water Center at Penn is fairly new, and we were looking around for partners, and not only did we find Kresge, but we found, I don't know, 50 other partners who are working on very similar things all over the U.S. And it's quite remarkable. And between Kresge and William Penn Foundation, Heinz Foundation, Spring Point Partners, all these philanthropies focused on aspects of water and equity, it's really a tremendous moment in time. It's just like, it's like we've been talking about this. You've been talking about this for I don't know how many years, but we've been talking about this for years and years, and all of a sudden it feels so real, like we can really make some difference at this point. So
Definitely.
thank you for that. And just one other comment before we get to the questions is you start off with the Indigenous Peoples Day, and that was so great. And my calendar still says Columbus Day, but then it also says Indigenous Peoples Day. Is like a little fight going on there between them. And in West Philadelphia, which is where the university is, it's mostly an African American community, and we're trying to work on developing, improving the urban watersheds, probably one of the worst urban watersheds in the country. And yet there's still land around it. And we've been dealing with these issues of like, how do you get stakeholder involvement? How do you get people in the community who are so focused on issues of crime, poverty, jobs, housing, litter, broken infrastructure? How do you get them to, because all I want to do is, I want to support community, and I really want to improve that watershed and do it in a way that doesn't create gentrification. And how, as a white-focused organization, University of Pennsylvania, working with, how do we even start? How do we get there? How do we make those kinds of connections?
Yeah, I mean, I spent several years working with We Ask for Environmental Justice, community-based organization that's been around, actually celebrating their 32nd annual gala tonight. And I got that question a lot in terms of if you're working in communities that are dealing with so many other issues, putting food on the table, crime, you name it, racial injustice, how in the heck do you get folks interested in the question of water or environment in general? And usually what I say is that, it's not a question of the communities wanting to be engaged, but it's more so, how do they see themselves in the solution? And so particularly as you talk about higher, institutions of higher education, and some of the, I would say, not so good relationships that have happened between community and institutions of higher learning. So the way that I would approach it, again, not knowing Philly as intimately as you, is really acknowledging and understanding what has been our relationship in community. how do folks see us? Do they see us as a partner? Do they see us as a threat? Do they see us as some entity that's coming in and buying up more buildings to push us out, which is a real thing. So I would just take some time to sit and listen with the communities that you think you want to build partnership with, because relationship and trust doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is really understanding what is the shared North Star. Like, this community might, again, litter might be an issue, crime, okay, two huge issues. So I can't even think about environment until you tell me, how do I address those issues? So as an institution, is there some way that you can begin to use your power to help not only address those issues that that community is facing, but then that also gives you an opportunity to say, well, oh, by the way, crime, and issues of litter, this kind of connects with really, the development of land and how you address some of these other water-related issues. So I think there has to be kind of a shared benefit, so really acknowledging that these are real issues, something that you can't just ignore. But then as you, over time, build trust and partnership, develop that shared North Star that might get at all these issues. And I would say the last piece is that sometimes environment, it seems, it's like this thing that is like, like a privilege to think about. When really, I think when I've done kind of community education, it's like being the translator and the connector, getting folks to understand that your environment is where you live, work, play, and pray. And all the things that make up the environment is important. So if you're addressing flooding, you're addressing racial injustice, you're addressing economic development, you're addressing all these different pieces. And so really showing that connective thread is super important as well.
Can you move to Philadelphia?
I love Philly.
All right, so we have a question from an audience member, and the question is talking about the JBA, which you have to remind me in the audience is Joint Benefits Authority in San Francisco. Joint Benefits Authority. It reminds this questioner about the Community Benefits Agreements, CBA. This questioner has worked with community groups who have advisory roles in new private developments. And are there any best practices for a solid community benefits authority?
Yeah, so I'll try and make this a little bit quick, and happy to have a long discussion. But I remember when I was working for the state of Maryland, and community benefits agreements, particularly on the air quality side, were super important. It was like, okay, if you're going to do this, what is the community going to get out of this? I think what's different for me with looking at the Joint Benefits Authority mechanism is that it is something that kind of forces all of these entities that work as silos to come together at the beginning, share their resources, but also do it in a way where it makes sense for them to work together to address their different problems, but also engage and involve community at the beginning. And so I think before you start any relationship, there needs to be an agreement, some type of understanding. And one of the mechanisms that we used to use was really a memorandum of understanding between the community partners in whatever institution we were working with. So I would encourage you to think about what is some kind of set of guidelines or ways that we're going to work together that you co-create to make sure that, again, when we come to this table, everybody is on the same level. Community members, if they're given their time, they're going to be compensated at this level. These are the shared goals. All those things are really critical to lay out beforehand if you can.
Excellent. I especially like the part about providing some funding for people of the community to sit in the room with people who are working like you or I and getting paid for that time, and recognizing that their time is valuable also. I have a really long question for you. I'm going to read to you. Thank you, Jalan. Okay. I work with TNC on a flood resiliency project in a watershed outside of Green Bay. One of the issues we are facing is how to balance the needs and interests of the upstream ag users and downstream urban users. There are concerns over how to ensure the funding of any benefit improvements or interventions or commensurate with the benefits received by each user group. Do you have any insight on how to address this?
So when I hear that question, my answer will probably be not satisfactory, but I think about this kind of notion of the urban-rural divide and how, my issues upstream or ag are so different from urban issues, when realizing we are all connected in some way. And I think, one of the things that has been a valuable tool is looking at the work of earth economics and really putting a price on, I would say, the whole chain of events when you're looking at water movement, and really understanding, what is the price if we don't help kind of manage the agricultural piece, the runoff, and then what that results in, both from an economic standpoint, from a health standpoint, and then what that means to our urban neighbors down the road. So again, a lot of this, goes back to the question of putting a dollar tag on it, a dollar sign on it, and really understanding if we don't do, what are the ramifications, not only for us, but for those downstream communities. And then as you talk about equity, and that needs to be a part of any conversation or process. You don't want, hoping folks have good intentions, how do you cause the least amount of harm or no harm at all? And so I think those are the types of things, in terms of the dollar signs that can make a better case or the right case for whatever decision, but then getting rid of this artificial divide between urban and rural, because in some cases there is no divide. It is a real situation that we have to look at all the pieces. We can't do the life cycle analysis of just the top. It has to include everything.
Thank you. And we're dealing with the same kinds of things in a project we're doing on the Delaware River, where we're looking at how do you get the Delaware River to be a swimmable river outside the industrial part of Philadelphia, and looking at certain groups of folks who want to jet ski down the river, and another group that is particularly Philadelphians, Camdenites, and others who are going to have to pay for this. And how do we create that access for community and make something that's fair? How do we find fairness between who pays and who benefits, and on top of all that is, what are the priorities between that and 15 other environmental things, just looking at water? So that's the future to me is very much there. I don't know if you're witnessing that same kind of paradox, or
I mean, that's life. I mean, all these problems are super complex, and if you do it right, you involve all those voices that have a stake in this. And it's not pretty, it's not elegant. Some folks are gonna, not be happy with the results. Some folks, but again, you have to have all these voices at the table and come to, a healthy compromise, or a point where we can all live together. So yeah, that's the work.
One last question for you, and it is 1 o'clock, and I understand some people are leaving, but please, you can come back and listen to the rest of this webinar. It'll be about another 5 minutes, and it's about the future and the next decade, and how do you think those of us who are working to advance climate resilience and water equity, and what should we be aware of over the next decade, whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing that we're gonna have to be thinking about?
Yeah, and again, thanks so much for this conversation, and apologizing for talking too long. I just get excited about the work. So there's a couple things that, over the next decade that I think we, have reason to be encouraged about. I don't know about you, but the conversations around racism and equity are front and center in so many different organizations. My hope that they go beyond conversations and into practices. So these uprisings, I think, have made more awareness, and I'm excited about that. I think, there are more institutions that are looking at themselves harder. And so I'm having a lot of conversations with, what can we do? How do we need to change? And I'm excited about that, because as we continue to look in, whether both as individuals and as institutions, we might uncover some, kind of shady stuff, but we have an opportunity to address it. I also think the philanthropic sector, again, we're kind of, we're taking a look at ourselves and we're amping up. And I think we've been a little bit safe too long. And so I think you're going to continue to see some changes in the way philanthropy funds, more funding going to organizations on the ground, things of that nature. And I think last but not least, in the water sector, we are having kind of a turnover, a next generation of water leaders, from where you're talking about plant operators to leaders of institutions. And so how do we build this pipeline?
Now you're going too far. Huh? Sorry, now you're going too far. Just kidding.
No. My big point is that, and I'm all about intergenerational, but again, I know for me, I want to be able to retire one day. And I know some folks that are thinking about retiring. But I think as we think about the pipeline of leadership, whether it be in the environmental movement, the water sector, like how do we begin to create that pipeline that is more reflective of our communities and get folks more engaged in the water space? So yes, I'll stop there, but thanks so much.
I was teasing you with that because, clearly mentoring and teaching leadership and getting people fascinated with the water business is really what it's all about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really what it's about. So thank you so much for the great presentation and the great dialogue. And for the audience to remember that the program's recorded and will be available starting tomorrow. Please take a moment to fill out the feedback survey. We love hearing the feedback, especially if it's good. If you have suggestions for speakers or topics you'd like to hear from, please let us know via the survey. And again, thanks very much for everyone for a terrific discussion. And I wish there was a way on Zoom that we could all say thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you very much. Okay.